get back into input validation and then on to exception handling, I want to look at assignment 1. Assignment 1 is now on Blackboard. You can find it under the assignment section. And here is your assignment, okay? So your assignment counts for 20% of your final grade. It's a fairly big project. It is due next Wednesday night at midnight. Okay. Here's what you need to submit. I need a link to your code on GitHub. Your repository, you need to create it as a private repository. Okay, it shouldn't be public, so anybody, any other student in the class can go and look at your code and take it. If you sign up for the GitHub Student Pack, which is free, you get free private repositories that way. And you can link it to, it used to be 5. I think someone has said that's now unlimited. They've removed that 5. It is unlimited. Now, so Jacob, if you already have a GitHub account, that's fine. You just create another one with your student email. You say you're a student, and it actually allows you to link the 2 accounts together. Okay. Yes. You'll have 2 usernames, so then you just use the student account one to create the repository as private. Okay, and it won't prompt you to pay. The private option won't say you need to pay. Okay, so you all have access to this as students. So please, I don't want you zipping and uploading your code to Blackboard. I accepted it for some of you for Lab 1, but by the end of today, everybody needs to be, and I got several people saying, I don't know how to use GitHub, it's not working. I know it's new for some people. I'll try to do a review of it at the end of class, and it's part of the requirement for part 2. Okay, so if you don't have your code on GitHub and you just upload it to Blackboard, you will lose marks. I would also, and hopefully we're going to get this working today, for those of you who were here last year, you should have your Azure account already. I would like to see your site running on Azure. First of all, you need to know how to deploy a .NET site to Azure. Second of all, you actually get your marks a lot faster, because if you can post to GitHub and post to Azure, Keyshawn, you did for your lab, very good. I can mark them much more quickly because I don't have to actually download everybody's files. I can just look at your code online, see all your code, and run it online. Otherwise, I have to download one at a time, unzip them, open them in Visual Studio, run the application, and look at your code, and then delete it and do the same thing 30 times.
Is deploying an ASP.NET site different than a regular, any other?
No, it's basically the same as what you did. We'll try to walk through it today. So the end of class today, I'll take week 5, I'll push it to GitHub, and we'll put it on Azure. Okay, so if you already know how to get HTML and JavaScript from Tom's class on Azure, it's no different. We'll talk about it at the end of class, because I know some people have Azure set up and some don't. The process is complicated. So for those of you who already have it done, great. For those of you who don't, we'll try to walk through it today. So that, Tom, that's why I sent out that message saying, make sure you have your own non-Georgian Windows Live ID, because you basically need a regular Microsoft account that is not your Georgian account. So your own personal live Hotmail Outlook and your Georgian email, and you need to link them together in the Azure setup is how it works. So you need both. Okay. This is an individual assignment. Yes, I'm asking you all to build the same thing, which makes it a little harder for me to catch you if you cheat. You cannot do it together and give me one project, 2 projects, each with your own names on them that you've built together. Everyone has to do this themselves. Okay. I think I did mention that last week in one of my other classes, I got a lab from 2 different students that had the same name on the lab. Those 2 students have different names. So it was pretty easy to know they gave me the same code, and the code was identical, including the name on line 1. Please don't do this. So all you need to submit is 2 links. Link to the private GitHub, link to your site on Azure. You're building a simple game calculator. I've built out a sample. I'm going to show you what it's going to look like in a minute. So you're going to create a new web application. Don't take your week 4 or week 5 project or mine from GitHub and add a new form and submit it. You have to make a brand new project that doesn't contain anything from class. You'll need to build a one-page input form, do some calculations and output. So here's your sample solution. So the link is here. So if I'm asking you to build it, well, I went and built it myself. So use a master page and use Bootstrap for the CSS. It doesn't have to look exactly like mine. It's a simple game calculator. So there's 4 games, the radio button for each and a calculate button. There's a bunch of validation, so everything is required, and I'll show you all the validation rules. For every game, there has to be a winner and a loser, so these are required. In every game, you get a score of 0 or more. Okay, if I put in a negative, I get a validator. Also, in any game, the points scored and points allowed must be different. Somebody has to win. So it can't be 2 points for and 2 points against. So in this case, notice that validator goes away. There's our ASP.NET compare validator, which we'll use. And then you have to have how many people watch the game. And again, it can't be negative. So just 1, 2. So when all the values are complete and they make sense, there's no tie games, there's no negative numbers. When you click calculate, you need to calculate out some values. So how many games were wins and how many were losses? Percentage of the games that were won. Then you have to total up the number of points scored, total up the number of points against, and then the difference. So if you got 8 total points and you allowed 7, the point difference is 1. Then you have to add up the number of total spectators and also calculate the average number of spectators per game. So this is what I would consider a complete assignment, posted on GitHub and on Azure. So create a master page, use Bootstrap. You don't have to get carried away, but make it look clean. So this looks like something, at least it looks good enough. If I'm going to go looking for a job, I can show something I've done with ASP.NET that looks reasonably professional. So create a header, basic footer, and you only need one ASPX page. Just call it default.aspx. So there are 4 separate contests, and each one has the radio button for win or lost, text box for points scored, text box for points allowed, and all the proper validation rules, and a text box for number of spectators. So how many people watched that game? And then here are all of the, so when a summary button, and when you click it, you're going to create an ASP label, and you need to name the labels descriptively. Don't name them label 1, label 2, label 3. Okay, should be label 1, label lost, label winning percentage, label point scored. Please give them descriptive names so I know what they are. And I've shown you how to calculate the winning percentage. So if you pick win 3 times and loss once, the winning percentage is 0.75, right? Winning 3 games out of 4, 75%. And for point difference, you just add up the total points scored, you add up the total points allowed, and you subtract them. And again, I've given you an example of the values. So here's how I'm going to mark it. So a few marks for getting things set up. The biggest part of the marks is doing proper input validation, so making sure the form is complete and all of the rules in the requirement are followed. No negatives, no ties. And then up to 2 bonus marks for any other features of your own that you teach yourself with ASP.NET and add. Here's one thing I'll throw out for those of you who figure this assignment doesn't look too tough that other students have done in the past that you can try. You can repeat all this code, or you could build each game as a user control, an ASCX file. That's a part of a page that's reusable. And you can create one ASCX and insert that ASCX 4 times. So in effect, your code is modular, rather than repeating all of this code 4 times. So that'd be a challenge for you. If you figure out how to do that, I will give you bonus marks. Okay. If you find some other feature you want to implement to make this better, I'll give you bonus marks for it, up to 2 bonus marks. So you only have to actually create 2 pages for next week, a master page and a default page. That's it. Okay, so you have from now until next Wednesday night. So you have 9 days to do this. So the link, if you want to run the sample, the link is here. So you can try this out and see how it works. Does anybody have any questions? Okay. Okay, so I want to go back to doing some more input validation. So we used HTML5 here, which works. Thank you, Thomas. I'm going to show you the ASP.NET validators. And it's really up to you on your assignment. I would like to see you use the ASP.NET validators and not HTML5 to show me that you understand how to use them. Okay. In a real world application, it's up to you to use whatever validation you think is appropriate. So I'll take that out. So let's look at how we can use an ASP.NET validator to make sure on our tip page that we get a numeric value. So I'll go back and reopen my toolbox. So what I want here is, well, first I want a required field validator because I want to make sure that on our tip page, the tip amount is not blank. So I'm going to put a required field validator on here. I'll just wrap it into a few lines. I'm going to change the error message like we did previously, so it just says required. And I'll add our CSS class like we did on our previous page. So we'll set the class as alert danger to make sure when someone submits the tip calculation that they haven't left that box blank. And if they do, we're using Bootstrap to display a message in red that says required. So this is exactly the same. I just need to do one other thing with this. What have I missed? That I didn't miss on purpose, I forgot. What will happen? ASAT? Sorry, Artem? What does it need? Yeah. So Artem, I'll let you answer solve our own problem. What control do we want to validate? Thank you, Anvinder. It's X amount. And this is also where you can see why giving descriptive names of our controls is important. If I call this text box 1, well, it's going to be harder to figure out what the proper control is to validate. I've named this text box descriptively as txt amount. So I want to validate that control. But now if I go back, reload my tip page, I shouldn't be able to just click my calculate button unless I've entered something in the tip box. words. So I've added from line 10 to line 13. Let's try it out. So now it gives me that little required message. That's good. However, it lets me do things like this. Which works, but doesn't really make any sense. I can't spend less than $0. So we're going to use another kind of validator to also make sure that we're getting a number that's greater than 0. So to do this, rather than using a required field validator, I'm going to put another one on. And what I want is a range validator. This will allow us to specify a minimum and a maximum, as well as what data type we're going to allow in that input. So I've grabbed one of these range validators, and I've just put it on underneath. So it's now showing up here. Now the error message by default says range validator, which is completely useless to whoever's using our website. What should the message say if they give us a negative number or give us a text value? Okay, we could just say, that's good. We'll want to add these two attributes as well. We'll want to add the alert danger class, so make that message red. And again, we'll need to add the control to validate. So which other control on our page is this validator supposed to check? So I'm going to add both of those properties. I want to also show you a shortcut. Notice when I start typing CON and it brings up control to validate, I don't have to type that whole property name. If I just hit the equal sign, Visual Studio completes the code. It writes the name of the property and it puts in the equals and the quotes for me. So coding this stuff becomes faster. So again, this is validating TXT amount. So not only are we making sure that field is in blank, we're also making sure that we're allowing an acceptable range, but we haven't said what the range is yet. So what we want to set here is a maximum value and a minimum value. How big of a number should we allow at the most? Whenever we use a range, we need to set both the minimum and a maximum. So our max should be pretty high. Something like that should be big enough. And our minimum can be 1 cent. The other thing we can set is the data type, and we need to set this. So we can set it as any of these data types. These are built in. Currency, date, double integer, string. So we could use double or we could use currency. Now if we try our page out, our range validator should prevent values 0 or lower. It should also prevent text, dates, or other values that are not numeric. Sorry? No, in fact, the validators, because we don't access them in C# code, you don't even really need the IDs. You could actually remove them and they should still work. We won't be writing any code against these, so normally we don't bother changing the IDs for the validators. If you want to change them, you can, certainly. But we don't have to in this case. So my required still works. Now, if I put in a negative number, my validator's checking. It's below our minimum value. If I type in a text value, it won't allow that. As soon as it gets a proper value, the JavaScript hides that class, right? It turns that error message off. Put in a date. And again, it shows up. Now, why is it showing up over here? Yeah, the required field validator is the space is being allocated for it, even though it's not visible. We can actually change this. So any validator that's active will show up right next to our box, which will probably make our form look a little better. So to do that, we're going to add one property to each of our validators. So in my required field, I'm going to add display equals dynamic. That means don't give any space to this validator unless it's visible. When it's not showing up, don't push other things out of the way. And we'll do the same thing on this one. Display equals dynamic. If we do it now, our range validator, either one of them should appear right beside the box rather than over floating off to the right. So add display equals dynamic to each of your validators. Try it again. Okay, that's good. So notice that white space is gone. So we have some control over where those go. So there's all our code for those. You'll also see we have compare validators. So this allows us to compare two different inputs. So for example, we have on a registration page, password and compare password. Password and enter your password again. The compare will let us check if they're equal. Or maybe we have a start date and an end date. What kind of comparison might we want to do with start date and end date to make sure they're valid? Yeah, we want to make sure that the end date is greater than the start date. So we can compare that things are equal or one is greater than or less than the other. We have all of those abilities with this compare validator. We do have regular expressions. So checking things like postal codes, phone numbers. We don't need these so much because now HTML5 can help with that. Email formatting, but we can do it with ASP.NET as well if we want. Let's do one other thing. Anybody have any questions about these ones so far? Okay. So that's how we would validate a text box. We need to validate well, right now we don't need to validate our drop-down list, right? Because right now there's no way to submit the form without picking a tip. We have 10% by default. If the user doesn't click anything, we get 10%. But many times in drop-downs, there is no option this is often not a great idea. Why is this not a great idea to just default to the first choice? Right, maybe they don't want it. So if we pick something by default, many people will automatically select that value when they don't want to or don't mean to. So let's add a default option in our drop-down list. So here's our drop-down list called DDL% last week. Let's add list item that says text equals choose. So this becomes the default option. This is what will display in our dropdown when our page loads. And typically we oftentimes, not always, but often we're going to see this in drop-down menus. There'll be some kind of default instruction asking the user to pick something. So this is probably better user interface design to have that as our first choice. Except now we've created a validation problem, haven't we? Yellow arrow screen of death, right? It's looking for a tip percentage, but we haven't provided one because the user didn't choose one. So we now need to add some some kind of validator here, so that if they don't pick something, when they click calculate tip, we don't want the form to be submitted and the calculation to run. We want to show the user some kind of error message. So what could we do? How could we do this? We want to use an ASP.NET Validator to give the user a message telling them to choose a tip before we submit the form. Well, we could do it in our C# code, yes, but typically I suggest from an interface perspective that's not great because we're already doing some validation on the, if we do validation, some validation on the client, we probably should do all of it on the client if we can. So yes, Artem, it would work. We could add an if statement in our code. When calculate is clicked, could we check the selected value of the dropdown and then display a message? We could do that. That would work. I'd like to try to do it just in our HTML using a validator instead. So what type of validator could we use and how could we get it to execute if the user doesn't pick 10, 15, or 20? Good guess. No, with the compare validator, that would seem to make sense, but it forces, compare is only for comparing two different inputs together. It forces us to compare either as an equals, a greater than, some kind of comparison between two different values. So that would be great. It's not designed that way, unfortunately. Any other thought? We could try required. Let's try it and see. Let me drag one on. I'll add the control to validate as DDL%. I'll just leave the error message right now. We'll see if it works. So I have a field saying my dropdown is required. But that doesn't catch it. It considers that first choice as valid.
We have a value, so we can give a minimum range to 0.01 or something, and other values will be greater.
I like that solution, right? All of the other choices have a value starting at 0.1. So if we give this first choice a value, we could, typically what I use is either 0 or more likely. What I actually do is -1 as my default choice. 0 would work. So if I make that first choice, assign a value of -1, now we can use a range validator to make sure the value of our drop down, the minimum is 0 and the maximum is, 1, for example. So by assigning this a value of -1, now we'll add another range validator. So I'm going to take out this. I'll close that up. I'm going to take out the range validator. Sorry, take out the required field validator. We'll keep our range validator here. I'll just make the error message say, choose a tip percentage. I'll use my same class of alert danger to style it. We'll say the type is double because our values are decimal numbers, right? 0.1, 0.5, 0.15, 0.2. So type is double. Minimum is 0. Or it could be minimum is 0.1. As long as that value is greater than our default choice. Maximum can be 0.2 or minimum can be 0.1. So unless the value of our drop down is between 0.1 and 0.2, we want the validator to display. Yes, it will actually give me an error. If I leave it out, it actually annoys me that a maximum is required. It shouldn't be, but if I leave that out, he's not going to like it. So I have to provide, when I use a range, you must provide both a minimum and a maximum. So if you don't know, if there is no real maximum, just set a number that's really big. And if there's no real minimum, set a number that's very low. So that has to be there in order for it to work. So we're saying, this value is okay, this value is okay, and this value is okay, but this one is not okay for us to submit the form. And we want to show an error message in this case. So now if we try it, oh, and I did not give it the control to validate. So I want it to check my drop-down list with the ID DDL%. Make sure the value is 0.1, 0.15, or 0.2, not less and not more. See if that fixed it. I'll put the code back up in a minute. Now it knows my value is -1, which is outside the ranges I'm going to allow. As soon as I pick something, that validation goes away. If I hit it again, it comes back. So this is what we want, right? Now the user can't break the calculation. The only way they can break the calculation, well, actually they should, is to turn JavaScript off. And it's very important when you use these range validators, critical that you include the type attribute. Whether it's double, currency, or in your assignment, you'll want to make the type for this page, right? What should the type be here? Yeah, those should be integers. They should be whole numbers only. There can't be 1.5 people watching the game. There can be 1 or there can be 2, but not 1.5. Okay, so all of these need to be whole numbers. So if you use range validators for those, make sure we use type equals integer, please. There is one other kind of validator you'll need to use on your assignment. We didn't use it today, but it's fairly straightforward. So here, to make sure any one game that the score is not tied, that these two numbers are different, you'll need to use a compare validator for that. So there are your compare validators. And instead of just having one, Rob, this comes back to your point, instead of just having a control to validate, there's also a control to compare property. So it will allow you to compare two controls and specify what kind of operator is it. Is it equals, greater than? Here, if I just drag one on, we can actually look at the properties for a minute. So when I click my compare validator, we'll make this a little bigger. So here are the properties that we get. What control are we checking? For example, what control are we comparing it to? What's the operator? So here are the different types of comparison. It could even be a data type check. We're just checking these two controls, both have the same type of data, even if the values are different. We want to make sure they're both numbers, or we want to make sure they're both dates, for example. So we have not equal all of those different operators. And that will allow you to make sure that this value and this value for any one game, they're not the same. So you'll need 4 compare validators in your assignment. 1 for game 1, 1 for game 2, 1 for game 3, and 1 for game 4. Matt?
The question about your example. So if I allowed, you mean like a goal or something?
Yeah, so this would be, these are the goals your team scored. These are the goals the other team scored against you.
So if we make it so it's allowed is higher than score, we can't have a goal.
If you do that, I'll give you a bonus. I didn't require it, but I probably should have. Well, if you picked that your team won, well, this score makes no sense, right? If you score 2 and the other team scored 10, actually, I think I should require that, really. That you'll need to do, there's no validator to be able to do that. You need to use logic in C# to do it, right? So this result makes no sense. If the other team scored more than your team, well, they won and you lost. Your team can't win if the other team scored more than you.
So when you set it up so that just by putting in the score, you automatically like, tick off that they wanted to tick off when they lost?
That's a great idea. I'll give you a bonus mark. Yeah, if you do that, that's a great idea. So as soon as I do this, so sorry, if it's like this, right? If it's like that, if I change that score like this, it will automatically change. If you can figure out how to do it, absolutely, I'll give you a bonus for that. But yes, you shouldn't be able to pick win if the other team scores more than your team. And you shouldn't be able to pick loss if you've scored more. So you should, but you'll have to check that with an if statement in your C# for each game. I think that's reasonable. Okay. So I'm going to take this compare validator off. But the validators are fairly easy and intuitive to use. As I said, we're using them less now that we have HTML5 validators, but they still do have their uses. So for the assignment, I would prefer, I know you already know how to use HTML5 validation. I'd like you to get a chance to practice using the .NET validators and see how they work. Are there any other questions about using the ASP.NET Validation?
Can we assign a one validator to validate multiple things at the same time?
You can't. No, there's no way to do it. There is, although what you can do, if you don't like this style of validating, of having different error messages, there is another control in the toolbox which you can explore called a validation summary. So that allows you, if you want to print, for example, all the errors in one section on the side or top of the page, you can send them all to the validation summary. So it will collect all of the validators there. So if you want to explore that in the assignment, you're free to. You may prefer that from a user experience point of view. Up to you. Are there any other questions about ASP.NET Validation? Okay. If there are no other questions, what I'd like to do is look at how we deal with errors in ASP.NET. So as we're developing, when things go wrong, it's good. We want to see those yellow error screens of death because it tells us what's wrong. It gives us an error message, tells us where to look to fix it. However, once our application is live and in production, we never want people to see those things. What should users see when something breaks in our application? We did it in our PHP class. Yeah, well, if it's a 404, we want to show them a 404 page. If it's some other error that's not 404, what should they see? Yeah, just a kind of a generic error page that still uses the theme and template of our site. So we'll want to create a 404 page and we'll want to create a general error page and look at some of the ways we can handle these things. Yep, and we can use inside of individual functions, we can use try-catch blocks, yes. So just like we use those in PHP, we'll also use those in ASP.NET, okay? So none of these things will take very long to implement. There's also Microsoft, I don't know that we'll have time to do it today, but I'm going to show it to you. Again, it's something you could implement in your assignment for a bonus. Microsoft actually has a built-in error logging module that we can plug in, and anytime it encounters an error, it automatically creates an error log for us, which is pretty neat. It's just a bit involved to configure it. I've put the link on Blackboard and I'll show it to you, although I don't think we'll go through it. It's not something that's required, but you should know it exists. So let's deal with 404 first of all. So in our assignment, if I mistype the name, I get that. So this is what our IIS error page looks like. So the first thing we want to do is let's create a 404 page that uses our master page, which will use CSS. So it looks like the rest of our site. And then we'll configure our site. So if we get 404, it's kind of like we did in PHP, we configured 404 in htaccess. Here we'll use web.config to configure for a 404 handler. So let's go back to our project. I'll right-click my week 5 project, and I'm going to add a new item to it. What item do we want? Thank you, Ari. Right, we want it to use our existing master page, and let's call it 404. Ask us, what master page are we using? Well, we only have one, so just pick the master page in your project. I'll put in a title, and we'll just put some static text on here. No C# code. We'll just put a generic HTML message on there. So we want this page to load if we get 404. And then we're going to go to our web.config file and we can set up some error handling. So if the server gets an HTTP status code of 404, we're going to take the user here. Doesn't really matter what the page text on your page says. Now we've added a new page. So what do we need to do every time we add a new item to our project? We need to rebuild, right? So it adds that page to our DLL so we can load it. So I should be able to actually go to my 404 page. It'll be a little slow after we recompiled. So this is what our page will look like. It's still not active though, because we haven't configured it to run. So let's go to our web.config. And here at the top, we have this system.web. In here, we're going to add, so we're going to add an error handling section in here. So we're going to use this tag, and this file, as Priyank found out, not picking on you, but it's helpful. The keywords in here, they're case sensitive. So what we want is to set up in here, we want to set up custom errors. Inside of our custom errors, we want to look for error status code 404. And if we find one, we are going to redirect to our 404 page. So this is very similar to what we did in the htaccess file with our PHP application. In there we had the error document 404 and then a link to our 404 page. So this is really the ASP.NET version of the same thing. We could trap for other HTTP status codes like 403, which is forbidden. For now, we'll only deal with 404. So if we save that, now when we make changes to web.config, because this is not part of our, there's no C# along with this, we should just be able to see our changes now without even having to rebuild. So now if I go back to my browser and try to load a page name that doesn't exist, maybe not. Let's see, maybe I do need to build. I knew I missed something. In my custom errors, I need to say mode equals on. I think that will get our 404 to work. So when we say mode equals on, means if we get an error, don't show the yellow error screen to the user. So if I try one more time. When I try going to a page that doesn't exist, we get our 404. So my other pages work. Lists we didn't build. We created a link last week. We never built the page. So when I click lists, I get my 404 page. So our applications, well, it looks like 404 is working. We actually have to do one other thing. Why, you ask? Isn't it time for a break? Is it not time for a break? Okay, interesting. Now we got, notice this 404 page is different from the one we got before. Why? Why did I get my 404 page last time but not this time? No, there's the error code. What was that, Devin? Right. The 404 handler we added, it works if I try to look for a file with an ASPX extension. Then it works. But if I try going to anything else, like let's say I try HTML. So the code we added works for 404, but only with the ASPX extension. So our job's only half done here, right? So we need to add something else in here. So inside of our, so this only works, I'll make a note of this. We'll make a comment here, and then we'll take a break in a minute. We'll add a few more lines just to fix this. So this only works for missing .aspx links. If there's no extension or the extension something other than ASPX, this code is not going to catch it. So here, we're going to create a system.web server tag. So we also need to configure 404 in IIS in general. So I'll just make a comment here. 404 handling for everything not .aspx. So in here we have an HTTP errors tag. We want to select that. We want to set the error mode equal to custom. We're going to clear that error out. And when the status code is 404, we're also going to take the user to our 404 page. And in this case, we need to do this as a redirect. So this is how we'll handle all the 404s at any path that doesn't include an ASPX extension. We're basically configuring the IIS server, any other 404 errors. Now this should handle both cases. An ASPX file that's not found is dealt with up here. If you say this is kind of stupid, one 404 handler should deal with all of it, I agree with you. But this is our workaround. And we'll find as we work with ASP.NET, sometimes we have to add these other workarounds.
So would you do your URL rewrites here, or would you still do
You can do them in web.config. There's also a file which we haven't added, we're going to use in a bit. There is a C# file that has no user interface that's called global. Write application level code in there. We'll do that later, and I'll actually show you in a few real applications some of the kinds of things we might also do in there. X. So we'll use that after the break. So with this code, now I can go anywhere. My 404 page always works. So I put in an HTML extension, I get my 404 page. I put in no extension, I get my 404 page. So there's all our code in web.config that we need. So everything from here, everything in blue I've added, and that'll take care of 404. It won't handle other errors, but it will deal with 404. Okay, it's about 10 o'clock. Let's take a break here. When we come back, what we want to do is look at how do we handle other errors, both locally using try catch like we did with PHP, and also how do we set up, we can also set up a global error handler. There's two places we can do it. We can do it in web.config. So any error that happens that we didn't put in a catch block, and also we can handle it in C# as well as a fallback. We can also send ourselves an email with that or log it. So we'll look at some of those things when we come back, and then we'll look at how do we push this stuff to Azure. Okay, so we'll be done exception handling. I'm stopping by 10:30 so we can try and spend a bit of time getting these things on Azure. Let's take a break now.